I wasn't supposed to stop that night, but the sound changed everything. It was just past 2 a.m., the kind of cold that slips through every layer no matter how many sweaters you stack, the kind that makes the city feel like it's holding its breath, and I was exactly where I always was, behind a row of closed shops on West 48th, digging through a dented trash bin for anything that hadn't gone completely bad yet, keeping my head down, staying invisible, because invisible people survive longer. That's the rule. That's the only rule that ever mattered to me, until a sharp crack split the silence and echoed off the brick walls like something out of place, something wrong, and then came the sound of footsteps, fast and uneven, followed by a heavy thud that didn't belong to the rhythm of the city, and before I could remind myself to walk away, to stay out of it like I always did, my feet were already moving toward the alley's mouth, my breath shallow, my fingers tightening around the frayed straps of my backpack like it could somehow protect me from whatever I was about to see, and that's when I saw him, sprawled against the pavement under a flickering streetlight, his dark coat soaking up the dim glow, his body too still for comfort, too composed for someone who looked like he had just lost a fight with something bigger than him, and for a second, I froze, because men like him didn't belong in places like this, not with shoes that clean, not with a watch that probably cost more than everything I'd ever owned combined, not with that kind of presence even while lying on cold concrete, like the ground itself had no right to hold him, and my first instinct was simple: leave, turn around, disappear back into the shadows where I belonged, because people like me don't get involved with people like him, we survive by not existing in their world. But then he moved, just barely, a small shift of his hand, a breath that caught in his chest, and something inside me twisted in a way I couldn't ignore, because I'd seen that look before, that edge between staying and not, that fragile line that doesn't ask who you are or what you've done, it just waits, and suddenly the cold didn't matter anymore, the rules didn't matter, nothing did except the fact that if I walked away now, he wouldn't make it, and I knew it the same way I knew how to read the weather in the cracks of the sidewalk or the way strangers looked past me like I was air, so I stepped closer, my boots scraping softly against the pavement, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it might give me away to someone, anyone, who might still be nearby, and I crouched beside him, close enough to see the sharp line of his jaw, the faint crease between his brows even in unconsciousness, the kind of face that didn't belong to weakness, and when his eyes suddenly opened, dark and alert despite everything, locking onto mine with a focus that sent a chill down my spine, I realized two things at once: first, that this man was dangerous in a way I couldn't fully understand yet, and second, that I had already made my choice the moment I didn't walk away. His grip tightened around my wrist before I could even pull back, not painfully but firm enough to remind me that whatever strength had left his body had not taken his instincts with it, and those eyes, dark and steady despite the way his breath came unevenly, studied me like I was something he needed to understand before deciding whether I was a threat or a mistake, and for a second neither of us spoke. The city humming quietly beyond the alley like nothing unusual had happened, like men did not collapse under broken streetlights, and strangers did not kneel beside them making decisions that could change everything. And then his voice came low and controlled, rough around the edges but sharp enough to cut through the cold, asking a simple question that did not sound like a question at all, asking who I was and why I was there, and I almost laughed because people like me did not have answers that mattered, not names that carried weight, not reasons that made sense to men who wore tailored coats and watches that ticked louder than my entire existence, so I shook my head instead and told him the truth in the simplest way I knew how, that none of that mattered right now because if he kept talking he was going to make things worse for himself, and something flickered in his expression, not fear, never that, but recognition, like he understood commands when he heard them even from someone he should have ignored, and for a moment the balance shifted in a way that felt unreal, like the world had tilted just enough for someone invisible to be seen, and I used that moment because I knew it would not last, sliding my arm under his and trying to pull him upright, feeling the weight of him, solid and unyielding, nothing like the fragile people I was used to helping, and he resisted at first, just enough to test me, to measure what I was capable of, but then he let me guide him, slow and careful, deeper into the alley where the light did not reach and the shadows wrapped around us like a shield, and every step felt louder than it should have, every breath too visible in the cold air, my heart racing with the awareness that we were not alone in whatever had just happened, that somewhere out there someone might still be looking, still listening, and I did not know why that thought scared me more for him than for myself, but it did. And when we finally reached the narrow gap between two buildings where I sometimes slept when the weather got too rough, I eased him down against the wall, my hands moving automatically, checking, pressing, doing the only things I knew how to do from years of patching myself up when there was no one else around, and he watched me the entire time. Silent now, his gaze never leaving my face, as if memorizing it, as if deciding something important without saying a word, and I felt it, that weight, that attention, heavier than anything I had ever carried, but I did not look away, because I had already crossed the line the moment I stayed, and when his hand caught mine again, slower this time, less force and more intention, his voice quieter but no less certain as he spoke, telling me that I should have left him there, that I did not understand what I had just involved myself in, I met his gaze and said the only thing that made sense in that moment, that maybe he did not understand either, because if I had wanted to walk away, I would have done it already, and something shifted then, subtle but real, like a door opening just enough to change everything, and for the first time since I had seen him fall, his grip loosened, not in weakness, but in something that felt dangerously close to trust. The silence between us did not feel empty, it felt loaded, like the city itself was waiting to see what I would do next, and I realized then that saving him was only the beginning, because keeping him alive was something else entirely, something heavier, something that required more than instinct, so I pulled my hand free gently and shifted closer, my movements careful but certain, ignoring the way his eyes tracked every motion like he was cataloging weaknesses, calculating outcomes, and I spoke. Again, quieter this time but firm, telling him he needed to stay awake, that closing his eyes was not an option, and for a second I thought he might argue, that same edge of control rising in his expression, but instead he exhaled slowly and leaned back against the cold brick as if choosing to listen was a decision he did not make lightly, and I used that, reaching into my backpack and pulling out the small things I carried for nights like this, a worn cloth, a bottle of water, nothing impressive, nothing that belonged in his world, but enough for mine, enough to keep someone from slipping away if they were not too far gone. And as I worked, my hand steady despite the cold biting at my fingers, I became aware of how wrong this looked, how impossible it was, a man who carried authority even when barely conscious, sitting in the shadows of a place he would never normally step into, relying on someone he would never normally notice. And the contrast made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, because I knew exactly where I stood in the world, and it was not here, not in this moment, not this close to someone like him, and yet here I was, and when I glanced up, I caught him watching me again, not with suspicion this time but something sharper, something more focused, like he was trying to understand why I had not left, why I had chosen to stay when walking away would have been easier, safer, smarter, and I felt the need to answer even though he had not asked, telling him that I had seen too many people get ignored, too many moments where help came too late or not at all, and I was not going to be another person who pretended not to see, and something in his expression shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like a crack forming in something solid, and he let out a breath that sounded almost like a quiet acknowledgement. His voice lower now as he said that people usually did not risk themselves without a reason, that nothing came without a cost, and I shrugged because that was not how my world worked. There were no deals, no contracts, just choices you made and lived with, and I told him that maybe he was right, maybe there would be a cost, but right now the only thing that mattered was getting him through the night, and for the first time since I had found him, the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly, not gone, never gone, but enough to feel, and then he said something that made my breath catch, not because of the words themselves but because of the way he said them, like a promise he had not fully decided to keep, telling me that if I walked away now, he would make sure I was never connected to any of this, that I could go back to being invisible, untouched by whatever followed him, and I understood then that he was giving me one last chance to leave, one last exit before whatever his world was came crashing into mine. And for a moment I considered it, the safety of disappearing, the comfort of returning to a life where nothing unexpected ever happened, but when I looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who should have been untouchable now sitting in the dark relying on someone like me, I knew that option was already gone, so I shook my head slowly and met his gaze, telling him that I was not leaving, not tonight, not like this, and something in the air shifted again, heavier this time, more certain, like a line had been drawn that neither of us could step back from, and when distant footsteps echoed faintly at the far end of the alley, too measured to be random, too deliberate to ignore. His expression hardened instantly, all softness gone in a heartbeat, his instinct snapping back into place as he reached for my wrist once more, pulling me closer with a quiet urgency that did not need explanation, and in that moment I realized the night was far from over, and whatever had found him was about to find us too. The moment his fingers closed around my wrist again, everything inside me went still, not from fear but from the way his entire presence changed in an instant, like whatever exhaustion had been weighing him down was pushed aside by something sharper, something trained, and I heard it too now, those footsteps echoing faintly against the concrete, slow and deliberate, not the careless rhythm of someone passing through but the measured pace of someone searching, and my breath caught before I could stop it, my eyes flicking toward the narrow opening of the alley as shadows shifted just beyond the reach of the dim streetlight, and he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper but steady, telling me not to move, not to make a sound, and I nodded without thinking because the certainty in his tone left no room for hesitation, and for the first time since I had found him, I understood that whatever world he came from did not forgive mistakes, not even small ones, and I pressed myself back against the cold brick beside him, forcing my breathing to slow, to match the quiet tension that seemed to wrap around us like a second skin, and seconds stretched longer than they should have, each one heavy with the possibility of being seen, of being found, and I felt his grip shift slightly, not tighter but more intentional, like he was grounding himself as much as he was keeping me close, and then the footsteps paused somewhere near the entrance, just out of sight, followed by the faint murmur of voices too low to make out, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might give us away. But I stayed still, because moving now would mean everything, and I realized with a sudden clarity that I was no longer just helping him survive, I was inside whatever this was, whatever had followed him into the night, and there was no stepping back from that, not anymore, and when the silence returned, stretching out just enough to make it uncertain whether they had moved on or were simply waiting, he shifted again, slower this time, his shoulder brushing mine as he leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed toward the alley's edge, calculating, always calculating, and I saw it then, not just the danger but the control, the way he processed everything even like this, even when he should have been too weak to focus, and it made something inside me tighten. Because I understood then that he was not just surviving this moment, he was already thinking about the next one, and the next, and the next, like this was normal for him, like this was the life he knew, and when he finally spoke again, his voice quieter but carrying a weight that made me listen, he said that if they came closer, I needed to stay behind him, that I was not to run unless he told me to, and the word should have sounded ridiculous, coming from someone who was clearly not in a position to protect anyone, but the way he said it made it feel like a fact, not a suggestion, and I found myself nodding again before I could question it, because something about him made you believe he meant what he said, no matter the circumstances, and then the sound came again, softer this time but unmistakable, footsteps retreating, fading gradually into the distance until the alley fell quiet once more, and I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my body finally releasing some of the tension that had built up in my chest, but he did not relax, not completely, his gaze still fixed on the darkness for a few seconds longer before it shifted back to me, and in that look there was something new, something that had not been there before, not suspicion, not calculation, but recognition, like he was seeing me differently now, not just as the girl who had stumbled into his worst moment but as someone who had stayed when leaving would have been easier, and when he spoke again, his voice lower, steadier, he said that I had just made things more complicated for myself than I could possibly understand, and I should have felt regret, I should have questioned everything, but instead I held his gaze and told him that complicated was better than walking away from something I could have changed, and for a second, just a second, something almost like disbelief crossed his face before it disappeared behind that same controlled expression, and then he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if accepting something unspoken between us, and I realized in that moment that whatever came next, whatever followed him out of the dark, I was no longer just a witness to it, I was part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. The quiet that followed did not feel like safety, it felt like a pause, like the kind of silence that comes right before something shifts again, and I could still feel the echo of those footsteps in my chest, the reminder that whatever had been looking for him had not disappeared, it had only stepped back, and he seemed to understand that better than I did because even as I adjusted the cloth in my hands and checked him again, his attention never fully left the alley's entrance, his body still angled slightly forward like he was ready to react if the darkness moved the wrong way, and I realized then that this was not just a bad night for him, this was a pattern, something familiar, something he had lived through enough times that even now, even like this, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead, and it made me wonder what kind of life required that kind of constant awareness, what kind of world forced someone to never truly relax. And before I could stop myself, I asked him, not directly, not in a way that demanded answers, just a quiet question about who he really was and why someone would be searching for him in the middle of the night like that, and for a moment he did not respond, his gaze shifting from the alley back to me, studying my face like he was deciding how much to say, how much I deserved to know, and then he exhaled slowly and shook his head just slightly, telling me that the less I knew, the better, that some things did not come without consequences. And I should not be asking questions I could not afford the answers to, and I should have pushed, I should have insisted, but something in the way he said it made me stop, because it did not sound like a threat, it sounded like a warning, and I understood warnings. I had lived my whole life reading them in the smallest details, the tone of a voice, the way someone looked at you, the shift in the air when something was about to go wrong, so I nodded instead and let it go, focusing on what I could control, the steady rhythm of keeping him here, keeping him present, and for a while neither of us spoke, the city continuing its distant hum around us, cars passing somewhere beyond the alley, a siren far away that faded as quickly as it came, and it almost felt normal in a strange way, like two people sharing a moment that did not belong to them, and then he moved again, slower this time, testing his balance as he shifted his weight slightly, and I reached out instinctively to steady him, my hand brushing his arm, and he did not pull away, did not react with that same guarded tension from before, instead he let the contact remain for a second longer than necessary, and when he looked at me again, there was something different in his eyes, something quieter, something that made my chest tighten without a clear reason, and he spoke again, his voice lower now, asking why I had stayed when I had been given every reason to leave, why I had taken the risk when I did not know him, and I thought about it, about the cold nights, about being overlooked, about how easy it was for people to pretend not to see what was right in front of them, and I told him the truth, that sometimes staying was the only way to remind yourself that you still had a choice, that you were still human, and the words hung between us for a second, heavier than I expected, and he looked at me like he had not been expecting that answer, like it did not fit into whatever understanding of the world he carried, and then he gave a small nod, almost to himself, before glancing back toward the alley once more, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed just enough to make me notice, more certain, more resolved, telling me that if we were going to get through the rest of the night, we could not stay here much longer, that this place was no longer safe, and I felt that shift again, the quiet moment breaking, the sense that whatever pause we had been given was ending, and as I looked at him, really looked at him, I realized that leaving this alley meant stepping further into whatever world he belonged to, a world I had spent my entire life avoiding, and yet when he met my gaze and asked if I could walk, if I could keep up, I did not hesitate, because somewhere between the moment I heard that first sound and now, I had already made a choice that could not be undone. We did not speak as we moved, because speaking felt too loud for a night that was already listening, and I stayed close to him, close enough to feel the slight shift in his balance with every step, close enough to catch him if he faltered, even though part of me knew he would not allow himself to fall, not in front of me, not now, and the alley seemed longer on the way out, narrower somehow, like it was trying to hold us there, keep us hidden just a little longer, but he did not hesitate, guiding us forward with quiet certainty, his hand occasionally brushing against the wall to steady himself, his breathing controlled but not effortless, and I matched his pace, careful, aware, every sound amplified in my ears, the distant hum of traffic, the faint rattle of a loose sign somewhere above us, the soft scrape of our shoes against the pavement, and when we finally reached the edge where the alley opened into the street, he paused, just for a second, his gaze sweeping the area with that same sharp awareness, scanning every shadow, every parked car, every flicker of movement that could mean something or nothing at all, and I realized then that he was not just leaving, he was calculating, mapping out the safest path in a world that clearly did not offer many safe options, and when he stepped forward again, I followed without question, pulling my hood lower over my face out of habit, blending into the quiet emptiness of the street like I had done 1,000 times before, but this time it felt different, because I was not alone, and neither was he, and the thought settled in my chest with a strange weight I could not name, and we moved quickly but not recklessly, crossing under dim streetlights that buzzed faintly overhead, passing storefronts with darkened windows that reflected our silhouettes back at us like ghosts, and every now and then I caught people in the distance, a late-night cab driver, someone walking their dog, figures who glanced in our direction and then looked away just as quickly, because that was what people did, they avoided what did not concern them, they chose not to see, and I wondered if they would have looked longer if they knew who he was, if they would have recognized the quiet authority that still clung to him even now, or if they would have done exactly the same thing, turned away and kept walking, and the thought made something twist inside me again, because I was the only one who had not turned away. The only one who had stepped into this moment instead of around it, and after a few blocks he slowed slightly, his steps less steady than before, and I reached out again without thinking, my hand finding his arm to support him, and this time he did not even glance at it, did not question it, just accepted it like it was part of the plan now, part of whatever silent agreement had formed between us, and then he spoke, his voice low enough that it barely carried beyond us, asking if there was somewhere nearby where we could disappear for a while, somewhere no one would think to look, and I hesitated for half a second, because the only places I knew were the kind of places people avoided, the kind of places that did not exist on any map that mattered, but I nodded anyway, because if there was one thing I understood, it was how to vanish when you needed to, and I led him off the main street, turning down a narrower path that most people ignored, one that curved behind a row of abandoned buildings where the lights did not quite reach and the world seemed to forget you were there, and as we stepped back into the shadows once more, I felt that same shift again, that quiet line between what I used to be and what I was becoming, and when I glanced at him, catching the way his eyes moved constantly, never resting, never missing anything, I realized that following him was not just about getting through the night anymore, it was about stepping into something that would not let me go so easily, and for the first time since this all began, I understood that saving his life might have been the simplest part of all of this, because whatever came next was going to ask for more than I had ever given before. The path I chose was one I had not shared with anyone in a long time, not because it was special but because it was forgotten, the kind of place the city erased slowly, brick by brick, until only people like me remembered it existed, and as we moved deeper behind the abandoned row, the noise of the main street faded into something distant and hollow, replaced by the quiet creak of loose metal and the soft whistle of wind slipping through broken windows, and I could feel him slowing again, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I noticed, because I was watching him now the way he watched everything else, tracking the smallest shifts, the almost invisible strain in the way he carried himself, and when we reached the narrow service entrance behind an old storage building, I stopped and pushed the rusted door just enough for it to open with a low groan that sounded too loud in the silence, and I winced before stepping inside, motioning for him to follow, and the darkness inside wrapped around us immediately, thicker than the alley, heavier somehow, but familiar to me, safe in its own way because it kept people out, and once the door closed behind us, the world outside felt like it had been cut off completely, and for a second neither of us moved, letting our eyes adjust, letting the quiet settle, and then I guided him toward the back corner where a few old crates sat stacked against the wall, a place I had used before when the nights got too cold, when staying outside was not an option, and he lowered himself down carefully, his movement slower now that the urgency had eased, and I knelt beside him again, my hands moving automatically, checking, adjusting, making sure he stayed present, and he watched me like before, but there was less edge in it now, less calculation and more something I could not quite name, something quieter, and after a moment he spoke, his voice softer in the enclosed space, asking how I knew places like this, how I always seemed to have somewhere to go, and I shrugged slightly, because there was no real answer, just years of learning how to exist where others did not look, how to find shelter in spaces that were not meant to be seen, and I told him that when you spend enough time being invisible, you learn where the world forgets to check, and he held my gaze for a second longer than usual, like he was trying to understand that, like it was a language he had never needed to learn, and then he nodded once, slow and thoughtful, before leaning back against the wall, his eyes closing for just a second before opening again, as if even that small lapse felt dangerous to him. And I could see the tension still there, coiled under the surface. The part of him that refused to let go completely, and it made me realize that even here, even in a place no one would think to look, he did not feel safe, not entirely, and the thought lingered in my mind as I sat back slightly, giving him just enough space while still staying close, and for a while the silence returned, not as heavy as before but not comfortable either, something in between, something uncertain, and then he spoke again. Quieter now, asking my name for the first time since this began, and the question caught me off guard more than anything else had tonight, because names mattered, names made things real, and for a second I considered not answering, keeping that distance, that safety, but something in the way he asked, not demanding, not commanding, just asking, made me exhale slowly before I told him, my voice steady despite the strange weight of it, and when I did, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the space between us had changed in a way neither of us could ignore, and when he repeated it back, low and certain, like he was committing it to memory, I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with fear, and for the first time since the night began, I wondered what would happen when the sun came up, because hiding in the dark was one thing, but daylight had a way of revealing everything, and I was not sure either of us was ready for that. Hearing my name in his voice did something I was not prepared for, something quiet but unsettling, like it anchored me to this moment in a way I could not undo, and I looked away first, not because I was afraid but because it felt too real, too close, and for someone who had spent years slipping through the edges of other people's lives unnoticed, being seen like that was almost harder than the danger we had just escaped. And the silence that followed stretched differently now, not tense in the same way, but heavier, more aware, like both of us understood that something had shifted without saying it out loud, and I busied myself with small movements, adjusting the cloth again, checking his breathing, anything to keep my hands moving so I did not have to think too much about the way his gaze still lingered on me, steady and deliberate, and after a moment he spoke again, asking how long I had been on my own. The question simple but loaded with more than it seemed, and I hesitated. Because that was not something I usually shared, not something anyone ever cared enough to ask, but tonight had already broken too many of my rules, so I answered honestly, telling him it had been a while, long enough that I stopped counting somewhere along the way, and he listened without interrupting, without that usual edge of control, just listening in a way that felt unfamiliar coming from someone like him, and when I finished, he nodded slightly, like he understood more than he let on. And then he said something that caught me off guard again, quieter this time, almost like he was speaking to himself as much as to me, that people were not meant to live unseen, that even the strongest ones needed someone to notice when they were still there, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was wrong but because it sounded like something he should not believe, not someone who carried himself the way he did, not someone who seemed to exist in a world where people were always watching, always waiting, and I told him that maybe in his world that was true, but in mine, being unseen was the only thing that kept you safe, and he studied me again after that, longer this time, like he was trying to reconcile those two versions of reality, and for a second I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, not just the girl who had helped him but something else, something I could not define. And before either of us could say anything more, a distant sound broke through the quiet, faint at first but unmistakable, the low rumble of a car engine slowing somewhere outside, close enough to matter, and his entire posture shifted instantly, the brief calm between us disappearing as his focus snapped back into place, his eyes moving toward the door, calculating again, always calculating, and I felt it too, that familiar tightening in my chest, the understanding that whatever space we had carved out for ourselves was not as hidden as we thought, and he pushed himself up slightly, testing his balance with more urgency this time, his jaw set in a way that told me he was already preparing for what came next, and he looked at me, really looked at me, his voice low but firm as he said that if things went wrong, I needed to stay behind him and not hesitate, not question, just move when he told me to, and I nodded before I could even think about it, because somewhere along the way I had started to trust that tone, that certainty, even when it did not make sense, and the sound outside grew louder, closer, until it stopped completely, leaving behind a silence that felt too deliberate to ignore, and for a second everything held still, like the world was waiting again, and I realized with a quiet certainty that this night was not finished with us yet, that whatever had been chasing him had found its way back, and this time, hiding might not be enough. The silence after the engine cut off felt heavier than anything that had come before, like the air itself was holding still, waiting to see who would move first, and I could hear it now, faint but clear, the subtle creak of a car door opening somewhere just beyond the walls, followed by footsteps that did not rush, did not hesitate, just moved with a quiet certainty that made my chest tighten, and beside me, he did not speak, did not need to, because the shift in him was immediate, absolute, every trace of exhaustion buried beneath something sharper, something controlled, and I saw it again, that version of him that did not belong in shadows or abandoned buildings, the one who commanded space without raising his voice. And when he reached for my hand this time, it was not to stop me or steady himself, it was deliberate, grounding, pulling me slightly behind him as he straightened just enough to face the direction of the door, and I followed without question, my heartbeat loud in my ears but my steps silent, because somewhere between the alley and now, I had learned how to read him, how to trust the unspoken things, and the footsteps outside slowed, stopping just on the other side of the door, close enough that I could almost feel the presence through the thin metal, and for a second everything went completely still, no movement, no sound, just that fragile line between being found and staying hidden, and I realized then that this was not luck anymore, not coincidence, this was something that had been following him with purpose, something that knew how to wait, how to search, and the thought should have scared me more than it did, but instead there was a strange clarity settling in my chest, because I understood now that running had never really been the plan. Surviving was, and sometimes that meant standing still long enough for the moment to pass, and his grip on my hand tightened slightly, not in fear but in assurance, like he was telling me without words that whatever happened next, I was not alone in it, and then the footsteps shifted again, moving slowly past the door, continuing down the path outside without stopping, without trying to enter, and the tension held for a few seconds longer before easing just enough to let me breathe again, and I felt the change in him too, the way his shoulders lowered just slightly, the way his focus softened just a fraction as he listened to the sound fade into the distance, and when it was gone completely, he did not move right away, did not release my hand, just stood there for a moment like he was confirming something only he could understand, and then he turned back to me, his gaze steady but different now, not just assessing, not just calculating, but certain in a way that made my breath catch, and he spoke quietly, telling me that the night had given us a chance, not safety, not yet, but enough to get ahead, enough to make a decision before daylight forced one on us, and I knew what he meant. Without asking, because daylight meant exposure, meant questions, meant everything we had avoided so far, and I should have felt overwhelmed by that, by the weight of what staying had turned into, but instead I found myself nodding, because the choice had already been made hours ago when I refused to walk away, and now it was simply a matter of following